Jesus. The whole time, Jesus knew how the whole thing would go down, and yet one of the most remarkable things about this story, it always gets me, is that knowing exactly what he's about to do, Jesus sits down and does what? He weeps. Do you see that? A strong confidence in the end of the story does not undo or justify the absence of grief in the middle. A mature faith adds its tears to the sadness in our world. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn," all the while not losing confidence in how that sadness will eventually be overcome in him. Who in this story knew the ending better than anyone?
So I don't know how well you could hear that, and I couldn't get any captions for that. But that's Reverend Chad Scruggs preaching a message titled Death's Conqueror. He's preaching on Lazarus, which we're going to be in John chapter 11 this morning. And he said a couple things. He said there's a strong confidence in the end of the story that it does not undo or justify the obstacles or grief in the middle. And he said a mature faith adds its tears to the sadness in our world. A few weeks ago, he proclaimed that in his church. This past Monday, he was informed that his 9-year-old daughter was killed at school. He's the pastor of the church that's related to the school in Tennessee. And as I watched that this week, I was thinking about, what would I get up in the next time I entered the pulpit to say? When I'd stood there the week before and said, a mature faith adds its tears to the sadness in our world. And certainly his heart must be heavy today as he's mourning the loss of his daughter. And then I thought of, this is what's happening on Palm Sunday. As Jesus enters into Jerusalem, the people are waving palms and proclaiming, Hosanna to the Lord in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus' heart must be breaking because he knows why he's going to Jerusalem. See, it's one thing to stand in a pulpit and proclaim on a Sunday, or to be at a parade and proclaim on a Sunday, when in the middle of that week it's going to become one of the most violent, horrible weeks you can imagine. It's quite another thing to practice our faith on a Monday afternoon when our own loved child moves from the realm of the living through the gates of death into the kingdom of glory. My prayers are with Reverend Scruggs today. I don't know if he's in the pulpit or not. But I honor him as a servant of God to stand and proclaim the word faithfully. I hope that I would have the courage to say the same thing afterwards that I said before, that a mature faith adds its tears to the sadness in our world. He's talking about Christ weeping, and we're going to see that in John 11 this morning. And I'm not standing here today attempting to scare anyone about the fleetingness of your life or the fragility of our life. But this is the reality of the world that we live in. We can proclaim peace and freedom one day and suffer heartbreak and mourning the next. And it seems like it becomes a more regular occurrence. But this is what happens in Scripture. In John chapter 12, when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, he's not as a conqueror of nations, but as a conqueror of death. And that may have been what those who were standing in that crowd were proclaiming. That, yeah, here comes the Messiah, the one who's going to free us from Roman oppression. Many Palm Sundays, I remember I have preached that very message, that the crowd's expectations for Jesus that day and his true intentions were at vastly different odds. He had even predicted that he would go to Jerusalem and be killed, yet it seemed to always go over the disciples' head. He even said it in 3 days, rise again, right? The gospel story that we tell, Jesus predicts it before Palm Sunday. And the disciples didn't want to believe it. Yet he saw that death was an obstacle that he had to overcome. And since the Garden of Eden, death has been Satan's tool and Satan's ally. I was reading this past week an article, and it said that, describing this idea of death, death is a thief and a robber. Death is a glutton and a plague. Death is the last enemy and the one that every human being faces. In our own power, that confrontation is entirely futile, and yet we're forced to enter into the fray. Basically, the idea is it comes for us all. And Jesus knew that, and he was aware of that, and he warned his disciples that this is really the plan that's going to happen to me as well as I go into Jerusalem. We've been talking in this series about the heart of God, about all these things, and today we come to this idea of God's heart about Satan and death and evil. You remember Jesus said to Peter, he warned them about Satan. He said to Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. He's aware of the spiritual battle, and Jesus says that to Peter. He says, Simon, you're not nearly as brave and as bold as you think you are. Then he told the disciples in John chapter 12, he said, on Palm Sunday, the next chapter, he says, now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. In acknowledgement that Satan's dominion is the kingdom of earth. And that's why death has hold on us here and holds sway over us. But that verse 32 of John 12 continues, but I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. It says he said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. He wanted them to see that his death was just an obstacle to be overcome. So we've seen from these passages in Scripture that God and Satan have been at odds before, with death being Satan's tool. In John chapter 8, Jesus described Satan this way. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And you see again this conflict between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. As Jesus is saying, Peter, Satan desires to sift you as wheat. He's a liar, the father of lies. We've seen that God's heart has always been at odds with Satan and evil. When it comes to death, I heard someone say once that Jesus was the worst funeral guest because he disrupted every funeral he went to. We're going to see one in John chapter 11 today, but let me remind you briefly. This one's Luke chapter 7. You remember this story. It says, soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, so Jesus was walking into this, and there's the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. It's a funeral procession. Look what Jesus does. The funeral procession comes, he's being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her, mourning this child. Verse 13, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, don't cry. Then he went up, and he touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. Imagine this funeral procession. He said, young man, I say to you, get up. Whoops. Whoever planned this procession, there's been a drastic change in the way this is going to go. The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Jesus is a funeral disruptor. There's other stories. You remember the story of Jairus' daughter. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus. Remember, Jairus had gone to plead with Jesus, hey, my daughter's sick. Please come help her. And someone comes while this is going on, as Jesus is on his way, and says, your daughter is dead. He said, don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe and she will be healed. And of course, that's what happens. He says, don't bother Jesus. She's already dead. Although that's no problem for Jesus. He's used to doing this sort of thing. So I wanted to bring these passages back to our memory to serve as an introduction to these opposing ends and the opposing means of Satan's bringing the tool of death into the world. And Jesus says, it's not an obstacle for me. On more than one occasion. When we turn to our main text today in John chapter 11, where in John chapter 12 is the account of Palm Sunday, but in John chapter 11 is the raising of Lazarus. Probably the most lengthy, most detailed account of Jesus raising someone from the dead. So we're going to dig into that a little bit this morning. We don't have time to read it all. I encourage you to do it this week. But there's an incident here in which Jesus is a witness to the sorrow that death brings to humanity. Much like that pastor opened with talking about a mature faith lends its tears or shares its tears to the sadness in our world. This is what Jesus does as part of this. Now look at John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now your minds are going back to Sunday school, right? You remember this story. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. We sense this relationship between Jesus and Lazarus. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Lazarus' death is going to serve a purpose. Now there's an interesting lead up in this passage. Before Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, all the things that happen here, Jesus says that he's going to bring God glory through this event. And the way he says it there, if I'm one of the disciples, I'm with them. Okay, Lazarus is not going to die. Jesus is going to go heal him and it'll be fine. So of course, once again, the disciples, like I said, would happen to me. They don't really grasp this. In John chapter 11, verse 11, it says, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. Right? Jesus always speaks like this in kind of odd ways that you really have to dig into what he's trying to say. And his disciples replied in verse 12, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Right? For all of us, we think that if I just could get some sleep, I'd feel better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, which he often does after they misunderstand something. He tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Jesus has a plan. So Jesus arrives there. Look at verse 21, and we know that Mary and Martha are his sisters. And it says, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, I don't know the tone that she says this with. This could be a very accusing tone. Lord, he would not have died if you'd been here. It's your fault. Or it could be just kind of a sorrowful pleading. Lord, I know if you'd been here, you could have saved him. It would have been fine. I don't know what her tone is in this phrase. But it kind of makes me think the second one. But she says, but I know that even now, verse 22, God will give you whatever you ask. You can still do great things. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And once again, right over her head, because look at her response, verse 24. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now Jesus got to clear it up, because Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Don't you understand who's standing in front of you? He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. So she's proclaiming her faith in Jesus, even though her brother's dead, and certainly she's mourning and sorrowful. Jesus says, yeah, but you're not getting it. Even though your brother's dead, I am the resurrection and the life. Death is not an obstacle for me. You as a human trapped in this finite mortal body, that is an obstacle for him, for them, and for all of us. And that's all her mind can comprehend. But Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. I always find it funny that Mary's reaction. Look at verse 32. Skip down to 32. So that's what Martha said. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus got to go, what are you two, twins? What's going on here? The exact same phrasing that Martha just used. It always struck me that both Mary and Martha have the same words for Jesus about their brother's death. If you had been here, he would not have died. They are both feeling this weight and this loss of their brother Lazarus. But they're also feeling the hope that Jesus could have changed it all. You sense that? Yes, the sadness and the mourning is there, but there's also a hopeful, you could change it all. And this is often the tension that we are required to live in the world today. We can watch a pastor and rejoice that he proclaims the name of Jesus and then mourn with him on a Monday at the loss of his 9-year-old daughter. See, we can come here on a Sunday morning and worship together and rejoice and proclaim, yea, on this Palm Sunday, Hosanna to the Lord in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then this week something else may happen and we'll be back to mourning and grieving. That's the tension that we live in. We feel the weight and the burden of all the things happening around us. Yet we also recognize the reality that Jesus can change it all in an instant. And see, Jesus has already instructed the disciples about Lazarus' death. He said this is going to lead to God's glory. So I wonder, what is the disciples' reaction when they think back that Jesus said this was going to be for God's glory and that he was just going to be ill, and now they show up and Lazarus is dead? What is going through the disciples' mind? I think it's because they must have been somewhat torn as well, because in the midst of this God's glory being revealed, which Jesus said was going to happen, there is still this human suffering. And this is a tragic story for us, for we easily and quickly realize that there is human suffering in our world. And many people respond to it by blaming God. I'm sure there were some who cried out this way, how could God let this happen? And it's a Christian school as well. Yet those of us who have been part of the Christian faith realize that it doesn't mean the end of our suffering just because we become a follower of Christ. In fact, sometimes it means increased suffering. When there's a violent act and death is the result, sorrow and anger are natural human expressions. And I don't know which stage of grief that pastor would be at this morning. I know if it was me, I probably would not be able to fill a pulpit the Sunday following my daughter's death. But I'm praying that his church and those who he has discipled for all those years are pouring into him encouragement and love and surrounding them with what that family needs. But then when violent things happen, sorrow and anger, that's a human part of us. And instead of responding, well, why did God let that happen? We got to realize that God was not blind to this. God knew this was going to happen. And that's what we see here in the life of Jesus talking to Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Look at verse 33. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. There's still this human side of Jesus that realizes this is human suffering and mourning. It says he is moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus is with us in our sorrows. Remember this, we sing the song, Jesus, Man of Sorrows? And then he says in verse 34, where have you laid him? And all of a sudden, this story begins to change because we know where this is going. And they've got to go, what does it matter? He's dead. Can't you see that we're mourning and we're hurting, we're grieving the loss of our brother? But someone there says, come and see. Like, Jesus, you're doing something foolish, but come and see. I've been referring to John Ortland's book, Gentle and Lowly. He has a quote about this passage, John 11, describing Jesus' response. And he says this, inextinguishable fury seizes upon him. It is death that is the object of his wrath. And behind death, him who has the power of death and whom he has come into the world to destroy. Tears of sympathy may fill his eyes, but this is incidental. His soul is held by rage. The raising of Lazarus thus becomes not an isolated marvel, but a decisive instance and open symbol of Jesus' conquest of death and hell. He can't stand it that Satan uses this tool against humanity. Ortland continues, what John does for us is to uncover for us the heart of Jesus as he wins for us our salvation. Not in cold unconcern, but in flaming wrath against the foe. Jesus smites it on our behalf. He has not only saved us from the evils which oppress us, he has felt for and with us in our oppression. And under the impulse of these feelings has wrought out our redemption. And God's people said. So Ortland, using these paragraphs, reveals for us Jesus' anger at death and the sorrow it causes, and that Satan would do this sort of thing. He sees it as a human obstacle that's causing broken hearts and grieving and causes him to grieve. Yet God's will is not that death should prevail. When we come to this part of the story, and I love to remind us that every good story or great story, play, drama that you watch always has a second act. Right? Usually there's 3 acts. The first act, the characters are introduced. We get to familiar with what's the scene and the setting, and who's there and what's happening and what's the crisis going to be. The second act then begins and the drama begins to build. The crisis comes to a point where it seems that all hope is lost and the lights go dark. The trauma is at its apex in that moment. And that seems to be where we are with Lazarus, with Mary and Martha and Jesus all just standing there weeping and mourning. In the second act, the situation seems hopeless. Then comes the third act, the resolution, the triumph, the victory that we all hope for. There's no resolution, right, if we're just left in that moment. It's kind of what happens on Palm Sunday. It leads into the second act where we celebrate the third act on Easter Sunday. I want to share a story with you. I was able to attend Cedarville Chapel this week. If you're not familiar with that, my son Ethan is there. And I've watched it online before. You can stream those sort of things, but it never quite captures the room. You're just seeing the speaker and that's it. And tragically, we were there on Friday, but tragically there was a terrible event earlier in the week. A young lady had committed suicide. And I'm not clear if it was on campus or off campus, but I was very curious that had happened earlier in the week, and we're going to be there on Friday. I was curious, so what is the mood of this campus? What's the students? Are they in mourning like Mary and Martha and others who would be mourning in this point? I was looking for what is the emotional and spiritual climate of this student body in this difficult week. And I'm not trying to endorse Cedarville, but when we left, I said to Tanya, I can't imagine any better place you would want your kids to be. When we went to chapel, we weren't too excited to be there. We found out it was going to be a freshman. First year in college, and it's like we didn't have high expectations, but he was really good and really solid, comfortable, opened up Romans chapter 12, and I was just very impressed. But that wasn't the most impressive thing to me. What I have to tell you is when he gave his text, they put his text up on the screen. Now, I was fully anticipating, there are churches where when the pastor says open his Bible, people open up their phones. That is totally what I expected when I got to campus there. I had even downloaded a Bible app on my phone because I wasn't planning to carry my Bible into chapel. So I was going to have my Bible on my phone. I have to tell you, I was probably the only one there that had a phone for a Bible. Because he says Romans chapter 12, and you see all this mass of 4,000 kids reaching into the backpack and pulling out a Bible. Now, it doesn't matter to me if you use a phone. I'm not trying to make a big deal about that. What was impressive about that is you see these kids reaching out in this midst of their hurting. A fellow student has committed suicide in that same week, and these kids are opening up their Bibles to find some source of healing and hope. And I was encouraged in that moment, because I'm a little older than most of those kids, a lot older than some of them. Now most of your kids are a little bit older than mine, but I know you've had this thought, what's going to happen to the next generation? Because we see our days getting worse and the world getting evil, and we think, what's it going to be like for my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandkids and so forth? And I'm not sure if this is an emphasis for Cedarville that they don't want them to use their phones and they want them to use their Bibles, but this is a common occurrence. Here were all these students reaching for the Word of God. And like I said, you may worry about the generations after us and what they'll have to face. But I would say to you today, take heart. There are places in the world, and there are younger people in the world who will, in moments of crisis, will reach for their Bibles and the Word and the face and the will of God. Don't worry about them. God will take care of them as well. Put that energy into other places. I'm preaching to myself as well. There are younger people in the world who are still seeking God in the midst of darkness. So we come to the third act of Lazarus' story. And you know how it goes. Jesus raises him from the dead, and we're going to talk about it to close this morning. But you may never have noticed in the 12th chapter of John, one chapter later, so Lazarus is raised now, and before Jesus has been crucified, an interesting thing happens. Lazarus' resurrection caused a problem for the priests of Israel. This will be on the screen for you. John 12, verse 9. One chapter later, after Palm Sunday, Lazarus has been raised. It says, meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there. And they came not only because of him, but also to see who? To see Lazarus. The word has gotten out. Right? This Jesus did something remarkable. It says, for an account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. This was the passage that Norma read to us this morning. So they're not coming to Jerusalem just to see Jesus, but here is a living proof that Jesus' death is just a simple obstacle for him to overcome. So then as I read that passage, I think, why would you need to kill a man who was already dead? Poor Lazarus has already faced death once, and now he's got the chief priest headhunting for him again. Because as long as this guy is alive and walking around as a living testimony, it's just people are going to keep following Jesus. And remember, that's what the passage says. The whole world has gone after him. That's what they thought. Many times, the victory in your life that Christ has already claimed, Satan will try to reclaim. Many times you thought you've already won that spiritual battle, but Satan says, but have you really? That's what's going on here. Jesus has a living proof of a victory he has already fought and won. And people are saying, but let's refight that battle again. That's what Satan's going to do in your life. Just when you think the victory's won, let's try again. Verse 17 of chapter 12. This is now Palm Sunday. Says, now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. So if their plan to kill Lazarus fails, we're going to advance to our plan to kill Jesus. And we know that ultimately that's not going to go well either. And just kind of, we should title this chapter, Pharisees and Priests' Failed Plans. That's what this whole chapter should be called. The word is now getting out and starting to spread, and the evidence that Jesus can overcome death is standing right there, and its name is Lazarus. Can you imagine the scene around Lazarus that week? Is that him? Is that the one? The whispered words around the corner as he comes walking down the street. We know this triumphant third act of this story, and we'll see the triumphant third act again next week. But it's important for us to note Jesus' final words about this situation with Lazarus. Look at verse 44. I'd never really seen this way before, but what Jesus says after he calls Lazarus out of the grave, what does he say to him? Take off the grave clothes and let him go. That's what Jesus says to Satan and death and evil in your life every day. As a follower of Christ, Jesus says to you, take off the grave clothes. You don't look like death anymore. You're not subject to death anymore. You are overcome that. You are now in the freedom and peace of Christ. Let him go. Like he says to Lazarus, there's so much more there than just raising Lazarus from the dead. There's spiritual freedom and spiritual victory here. And we all live under this physical curse of death, but Jesus' words to death are, take off the grave clothes and let him go. You see, we don't have to live with that curse on your head. Jesus says, let him go. Do you remember those famous words that Jesus said on the cross, the very last thing he said? It is finished. Now, in that moment, I think Satan misunderstands Jesus. I can just see him going, that's right. He's dead. I've got this sucker won. But what Jesus is actually saying is, what I've come to accomplish in overcoming death, it's finished. Death is finished. Has no claim here anymore. Satan thinks he has won and victory is his. Jesus is dead. Death has claimed the Son of God. But when Jesus says it is finished, he's claiming victory. This battle is over. This battle is won. Death was defeated. It no longer has a claim on humanity. It is finished. When John is thinking about this whole gospel story that he has witnessed in the book of Revelation, he writes as he sees this vision of Jesus, and he puts these words in his vision in the mouth of Christ. He says, do not be afraid. This is Jesus speaking. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. Not the, I am the, the one who you saw die. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Not just did I overcome death, I've got the keys. There's a whole lot more symbolism there we could explore about Christ being the key to our salvation and our hope and our everlasting life. That's still good news for us today, that as John thinks about that passage, that's what he hears Jesus saying to us. Death is not the victor. It has been defeated. And I wanted to close with this verse this morning. It's in your bulletin, so I wanted to make sure you had it. Hebrews chapter 2. The author of the Hebrews kind of summarizes all this for us into just a few verses. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, he's describing Jesus. And remember, in this whole book of Hebrews, Jesus is better than the high priest. He's better than the law, better than everything else. He says, since the children, talking about us, have flesh and blood, he too, being Jesus, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death. But we already read who's got the keys now. That is the devil. And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. And I was reading through this passage again this morning. People came to my mind, and I shared this story with you of people who I've worked with and been around who live in the slavery of the fear of death. Their whole life is consumed about trying to live as long as they can because they do not have hope for what lies beyond this simple mortal life that we live now. So I would encourage us this week that as we move towards Easter next Sunday, let's not go so quick to the resurrection that we miss the death price that was paid on Good Friday. Let's not overlook that battle that was won. It was on the cross when he said, "It is finished," not at the resurrection. Because there was a victory being won in that moment. And again, we say, how can we call the day of the death of Jesus a good day, as in Good Friday? That's because he hung there and proclaimed victory. It is finished. Let's pray. Our Father, we come humbly before you, thankful for the sacrifice of our Savior. And we will come together again next week and celebrate the wonderful hope of Easter and the triumph over the grave. But today we come to the passage where death is defeated. Not just in Lazarus, not just in the widow from Nain, but in the one who proclaimed, "It is finished." We may have moments this week and opportunities to reflect. Pray that you would remind us of what needed to be done on our behalf. We thank you for the atoning blood of Christ that was shed for the forgiveness of sins, to restore us and renew us in relationship with you so that we can come boldly before your throne of grace and have the hope and the promise of eternal life. And God's people said, amen. As you know, we've been spending some time reflecting towards the end of the series, and we're going to do that just now and ask Norma to come. We're going to do some